The hull breach alarm hit 3 seconds before the wall buckled, and by then Darius Koval already had his hands buried in the guts of conduit relay 7, 70 meters below the Cassini Vanguard's waterline. He felt the impact before the klaxon caught up. A deep, structural shudder that traveled through the deck plates and into his knees and up through his wrists, where they gripped the relay housing. The shudder carried information his body read faster than his conscious mind could process. Something had struck the outer hull, port side, between frames 42 and 48, close enough to the secondary coolant manifold that the temperature differential across the conduit bank shifted by 9 degrees in under 2 seconds. 9 degrees. In a ship running combat silent through uncharted space, 9 degrees meant the insulation layer between the outer armor and the service corridor had been compromised, which meant the hull had been breached, which meant something out there had found them despite the Vanguard running dark, no active sensors, no drive emissions, no electromagnetic signature above background cosmic radiation. Koval, damage report. Commander Salazar's voice came through the intercom with the flat cadence of a woman who had already processed the alarm and moved past it. Darius pulled his left hand free of the relay housing, smearing hydraulic fluid across the diagnostic panel mounted to the bulkhead. The readout confirmed what his knees had told him. Hull breach, port side frame 44. Outer skin only inner pressure hull holding. Coolant manifold 6 showing thermal bleed but no rupture. Whatever hit us, it wasn't trying to kill us. Confirmed. We took a grazing shot from something that just appeared on passive sensors at 400 kilometers. CIC is calling it a probe non-kinetic low yield, possibly a range-finding ping. A range-finding ping. Someone had reached out and touched the Cassini Vanguard the way a hunter touched a bush to see what bolted. Darius sealed the relay access panel and moved aft through the red-lit service corridor, his boots finding the maintenance ladder by muscle memory. The Vanguard was a Forge-class fleet support cruiser, not a warship, not a diplomat, but the engineering backbone of any Terran deep space formation. 240 crew, half of them specialists like Darius, reactor techs, hull fabricators, systems integrators, the people who kept capital ships fighting after the fighting started. The Vanguard carried no offensive weapons heavier than point defense arrays. What it carried was a machine shop that could fabricate replacement hull sections in vacuum, a reactor plant that could power a small city, and the institutional knowledge of a crew that had been trained to fix anything the galaxy could break. They had not expected to need those skills on the first day. The mission briefing had been sparse. Terran Fleet Command had detected organized electromagnetic activity in the Varus Expanse, a region of space previously catalogued as empty. Not naturally empty, artificially empty. The kind of empty that happened when a civilization deliberately suppressed its emissions, scrubbed its signal footprint, and withdrew behind detection thresholds that suggested a species actively hiding from the rest of the galaxy. Fleet Command had dispatched a contact group, the destroyer Ironholt running point, the diplomatic corvette Accord carrying the negotiation team, and the Vanguard providing engineering support and serving as the formation's mobile repair facility. 3 ships, minimal footprint, the kind of formation that said we come in peace but we came prepared. The contact group had dropped out of superluminal transit 6 hours ago, at the edge of the Varus Expanse, and immediately gone dark. Standard first contact protocol. Arrive quiet, listen, let the locals make the first move. The locals had made their move. A range-finding shot that grazed the Vanguard's port hull and left a scar 12 meters long and 2 centimeters deep in the outer armor. Darius reached the main engineering deck and found his team already at their stations. Chief Petty Officer Yeon-Soo Park had the damage control board lit up, her fingers moving through repair protocols with the economy of a woman who had done this in 3 combat theaters. Structural technician Myra Obasi was running hull integrity scans from the secondary console, her eyes tracking data streams with the focused patience of someone who understood that the difference between a stable hull and a catastrophic decompression lived in the margins. Reactor specialist Thomas Breda was monitoring the power plant's thermal signature, making sure the breach hadn't compromised their stealth profile. One thermal spike in the wrong spectrum, and the Vanguard would light up on every sensor in the expanse like a flare in a coal mine. "Talk to me," Darius said. Park didn't look up. "Breach is clean. Whatever hit us used a coherent energy beam at low power, cut through the outer skin like a scalpel, barely scorched the insulation layer, didn't touch the pressure hull. If they wanted to open us up, they could have. This was a message." "Saying what?" "Saying we see you." Darius let that settle. The Vanguard had been running dark for 6 hours. No emissions. No active sensors. The ship's stealth suite was fleet-grade, not the classified systems the Iron Holt carried, but good enough to reduce the Vanguard's signature to something indistinguishable from a drifting nickel-iron asteroid. And whatever was out there had found them anyway, identified them as artificial, and placed a shot precisely enough to breach the outer hull without triggering any of the automated damage control responses that would have flooded the breach zone with sealant and blown their thermal profile wide open. That level of precision required knowledge, not just of where the Vanguard was, but of how it was built, where the outer skin ended and the pressure hull began, where the insulation layer sat, how much energy it took to cut through the first without touching the second. Someone had studied Terran ship construction closely, recently, and used that knowledge to deliver a message calibrated to arrive without killing anyone. He assigned Park to the hull repair, Obasi to the thermal restoration, and Breda to monitoring the reactor's heat signature. Then he pulled up the passive sensor feed on the engineering console, because Darius Koval had spent 22 years in Terran fleet engineering, and he had learned that the best way to understand what you were dealing with was to look at what it had built. The intercom clicked again. "All stations, this is the captain. We have positive identification on the contact. Passive sensors are showing a structure at bearing 275, range 380 kilometers. It's not a ship, it's a station. Estimate 60 kilometers across the longest axis. We are looking at a habitat population unknown, technology assessment ongoing. The contact group will hold position and attempt communication. Engineering, I need that hull breach sealed and our thermal profile restored within 90 minutes. Salazar out." 60 kilometers. Darius had served on orbital stations. The largest Terran deep space installation, the Meridian Yards at L4, measured 11 kilometers across, and that had taken 40 years of continuous construction. Whatever species had built a habitat 60 kilometers wide had done so with manufacturing capability that made Terran heavy industry look like a child fitting blocks together on a floor. The station filled the engineering display when he pulled it up. It was not like anything in the Terran architectural vocabulary, where human stations were modular standardized sections bolted and welded into functional configurations, each joint a negotiation between materials that had to be forced into cooperation. This structure was organic, curved, asymmetric. The outer surface was textured with patterns that repeated at multiple scales, like the branching architecture of a nervous system or the fractal geometry of a river delta seen from orbit. No visible seams, no modular joints, no evidence that any part of it had ever been a separate piece. The hull, if it could be called a hull, appeared to be a single continuous surface, grown rather than assembled, with the material density and structural coherence of something that had never known the violence of a weld. Bioluminescent nodes pulsed across the surface in patterns too regular to be random and too complex to decode at first glance. The station's thermal profile was strange, warm zones distributed in clusters that suggested biological activity, interspersed with cold zones that read like structural support or storage. The entire thing radiated at frequencies just above background, as though it was designed to be nearly invisible until you were close enough to see it with your own eyes. A grown station. 60 kilometers of living architecture, hidden in an artificially empty region of space, built by a species that had taken one look at the Terran contact group and responded with a shot that said, "I know exactly what you are, and I choose not to kill you." Darius felt the fear settle into his chest like ballast. Not panic. He had been in 3 combat theaters and a reactor breach, and panic was something his nervous system had learned to defer. This was the slower fear, the deep, structural kind that came from understanding that the thing you were looking at operated on principles you could not reverse engineer by staring at it, and that the gap between your technology and theirs might not be a gap at all but a difference in kind. Like comparing a combustion engine to a living heart. Same function, entirely different architecture, one you could take apart and understand with a wrench and a schematic, the other you could only study while it was still alive. Park appeared at his shoulder, reading the display over his arm. She was silent for 10 seconds, a lifetime for a woman who typically communicated in half sentences and impatient gestures. "That's not built," she said finally. "That's cultivated." Darius nodded. There was nothing to add. "Koval," the intercom again. Commander Salazar, but her tone had shifted. The flat professional cadence had acquired an edge that Darius recognized from the Meridian Yards incident, when a structural failure in the drydock framework had threatened to collapse an entire construction bay onto 200 workers. The edge of someone managing a situation that was deteriorating faster than the briefing had prepared for. "CIC needs you on the bridge. Bring your portable diagnostic kit." He grabbed the kit, a hardened case containing 26 tools, 3 handheld scanners, and a universal interface module that could handshake with any system built on electromagnetic principles, and climbed. The bridge of the Cassini Vanguard was not designed for drama. A Forge-class cruiser's command center was an engineering workspace first, and a tactical center second, smaller than a destroyer's CIC, with consoles oriented toward damage control, fleet repair coordination, and resource management rather than weapons targeting. Captain Alara Vazic sat at the center station, a stocky woman with close-cropped gray hair and the permanently creased expression of someone who had spent 30 years solving problems that other people's decisions created. The main display showed the station, and something else. A smaller object had detached from the station's surface and was approaching the contact group. Not a ship, not in any configuration Darius recognized. A roughly spherical mass, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, with no visible propulsion system. It moved through space at a constant velocity, decelerating smoothly as it approached, without any thrust signature, without any visible drive mechanism, without any explanation that Terran physics could provide for how a 30-meter object changed its velocity in vacuum, without expelling reaction mass. "It stopped accelerating 12 minutes ago," the sensor operator reported. "Current velocity will bring it to rest approximately 200 meters from the Vanguard's port side, the side with the breach. The side they had marked, the side they had touched. The message they had sent, 'We see you,' was being followed by a second message, 'We are coming to look.'" Captain Vazic turned to Darius. Her eyes held the expression of a commander who had just made a calculation that fell outside every parameter the Academy had trained her for. "The Ironholt's captain wants to put a warning shot across its path. I talked him down. Whatever that thing is, it's heading for us, not the destroyer, not the diplomatic corvette, the engineering ship, the one they tagged. Why would they come to us? That's what I need you to figure out. You're the closest thing I have to someone who can assess an alien technology platform in real time. The Accord science team is 40 minutes from getting a remote lab online. I don't have 40 minutes. That object will be alongside in 22. I need your eyes and your diagnostic kit and your best guess about what it is, what it wants, and whether it's going to kill my crew." Darius looked at the display. The spherical object drifted toward them with the patient inevitability of a tide. No weapon's signature, no shields, no electromagnetic emissions beyond a faint bioluminescent pulse that matched the pattern on the station's surface. "It's unarmed," he said. "You're certain?" "No, I'm reading what I can read. It has no energy signature consistent with weapons systems I understand. It has no shield harmonics. It's not radiating anything that looks like targeting acquisition. If it's armed with something I can't detect, which means my assessment is worthless anyway, and we're back to a judgment call." Vazik almost smiled. "Honest, good. Get to the port observation bay, take a damage control team. If it parks alongside our breach, I want your hands on the problem." He took Park and Obasi. They reached the port observation bay, a reinforced viewport module used for EVA staging and exterior hull inspection, in 9 minutes. Through the armored glass, the void was empty except for the distant glow of the station, and growing closer with each minute, the sphere. It arrived without sound, without drama, without the theatrical menace of a warship powering up its arrays or the cautious choreography of a diplomatic shuttle matching velocities. It simply drifted to a stop 200 meters from the Vanguard's damaged port side, hung motionless for 30 seconds while its bioluminescent surface pulsed with patterns that the scanner registered as information dense, and then did something that made Park inhale sharply. It opened. The sphere's surface peeled back in sections, not mechanical hatches operating on hinges and servos, but organic membranes retracting like the iris of an eye, revealing an interior that glowed with warm bioluminescence. And from that interior, something emerged. Not a weapon, not a probe, not a drone. A being. It was large, 3 meters, perhaps more, difficult to gauge against the featureless void. Its body was bilaterally symmetric but not humanoid, a broad central torso supported by 4 limbs that served equally as legs or arms, depending on orientation. The skin, if it was skin, had the translucent quality of depotion tissue, with structures visible beneath the surface that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns as the station. No suit, no helmet, no visible life support apparatus of any kind. The being existed in vacuum, the way a fish existed in water naturally, without accommodation, without the elaborate technological mediation that a human required to survive outside atmosphere. It carried something, a flat, oblong object roughly a meter across, held in 2 of its 4 limbs with the careful grip of someone carrying something fragile and important. The object's surface shimmered with the same bioluminescent patterns, shifting in slow waves that the scanner read as data-rich. The being crossed the 200 meters of void between its sphere and the Vanguard's hull. No thruster, no propulsion visible, no reaction mass expelled. It moved through vacuum with a fluid grace that suggested the void was not hostile to it, that it belonged here, in the cold and the dark and the radiation, in the way that a Terran belonged on a forest floor or a riverbank. It stopped at the breach. Darius watched through the observation port as the alien being positioned itself alongside the 12-meter scar in the Vanguard's outer hull. It extended 2 limbs and touched the damaged armor plating with a gentleness that read, even across the gulf of xenobiology, as deliberate care. The bioluminescent patterns in its skin shifted, brightening at the points of contact, cycling through frequencies that the portable scanner in Darius's kit registered as information-dense structured data. The being was reading the hull, not scanning it with instruments mounted on a bracket or held in a mechanical arm. Reading it through direct physical contact, the way a Terran doctor palpated tissue to assess an injury beneath the skin. Then it placed the oblong object against the breach. The object adhered to the hull surface and began to change. The bioluminescent patterns accelerated, and the object's surface flowed. There was no other word for it across the damaged area, filling the 12-meter scar with material that bonded to the Vanguard's armor plating at a molecular level. Darius watched his diagnostic scanner and saw the thermal differential across the repair zone drop from 9 degrees to 2 degrees in 90 seconds. The structural integrity readings climbed steadily. The breach was being sealed, not with Terran sealant or welded patch plates or emergency foam, but with something that was integrating itself into the existing hull structure as though it had always been part of the ship. "It's fixing us," Park said. Her voice carried the specific tone of an engineer encountering something that violated her professional understanding of how materials behave, not anger, not fear, but the disorientation of competence meeting its boundary. Whatever that stuff is, it's bonding at the molecular level. It's not a patch. It's not filler. It's a graft. The lattice is matching the crystal structure of our alloy at the bond interface. Obasi was running scans from the secondary portable unit. Thermal profile normalizing. The graft material is insulating as it bonds. It's restoring the thermal barrier the breach broke. We'll be back within stealth parameters in minutes, not hours. The being completed the repair in 4 minutes. It withdrew its limbs from the hull, collected the now depleted oblong carrier, and turned toward the observation port. And looked at Darius. Through the reinforced glass, across the narrow gap between the hull and the void, the alien being oriented its sensory apparatus, clusters of light-sensitive organs arranged in a wide band around the upper portion of its torso, each cluster independently mobile, capable of focusing in different directions simultaneously toward the observation port where 3 humans stood watching. The bioluminescent patterns in its skin shifted to a new configuration. Slow, steady, rhythmic. A pulse pattern that repeated with the regularity of a heartbeat or a signal beacon. Darius had spent 22 years reading machines, interpreting the language of pressure differentials, thermal gradients, vibration harmonics, the 1,000 ways a mechanical system communicated its condition to anyone who knew how to listen. Machines told you what was wrong with them. Machines told you what they needed. You just had to learn their vocabulary, sit with them long enough, pay attention to the signals they were producing whether anyone was listening or not. This being was not a machine, but it was communicating. The bioluminescent patterns were not random. They were structured, repeating, organized. A signal encoded in light, broadcast from a body that produced meaning the way a reactor produced heat, as a continuous, fundamental output of its operation. He held up his hand against the glass, spread his fingers. The most basic human gesture of non-threat he could think of. I am unarmed. I am open. I am here. The being's bioluminescent patterns shifted. Something new entered the rhythm, a variation on the repeating pulse, an addition to the pattern that had not been there before Darius raised his hand. A response. Darius did not know what it meant, but he knew that it was a response, and he knew that a response meant the beginning of a conversation, and he knew that in 22 years of reading the language of broken machines and failing systems, the first step was always the same. You showed up, you looked, you listened, and you started where the damage was. "Captain," he said into the intercom, his voice steady despite the hammering of his pulse against his suit collar. "The breach is sealed, the alien repaired it, and I think it wants to talk." The next 6 hours were the longest of Darius's career, and he had once spent 14 hours in an EVA suit welding reactor, shielding onto the hull of a crippled destroyer, while its crew evacuated around him. Captain Vazic made a decision that the after-action report would describe as unorthodox, the diplomatic corps would praise as inspired, and the Iron Holt's captain would formally protest as a violation of first contact security protocol. She opened the port airlock. Not to let the alien in. The being existed in vacuum without protection, A pressurized, oxygenated environment might be lethal to an organism that had evolved to thrive in the void. She opened the airlock so that Darius could go out. He suited up in EVA gear, standard issue, 12 hours of life support, magnetic boots, a toolkit clipped to the hardpoints on his suit's torso, and the diagnostic scanner strapped to his left forearm. No weapons. The EVA suit had no provisions for weapons because the Vanguard's crew were engineers, not Marines. The closest thing to a weapon in Darius's kit was a plasma cutter rated for hull alloy useful for cutting damaged plating, useless against a being that survived in vacuum without a suit. He stepped through the airlock and into the void. The transition was the same as it always was, the hiss of pressure equalizing, the suit seals hardening, the sudden silence of vacuum replacing the Vanguard's constant operational hum with the sound of his own breathing. Then the outer door opened, and the universe was there, vast and indifferent and lit by the distant glow of the Varus expanse's scattered stars. The alien waited. It had not moved from its position near the repaired breach. The sphere hovered 200 meters behind it, open, patient, the bioluminescent interior pulsing with a slow rhythm that might have been a resting state, or might have been communication with the station, or might have been something Darius had no framework for interpreting. Between the sphere and the Vanguard, the void was as empty as it had always been, cold, dark, the stars ancient and fixed in every direction, offering no reference point for the scale of what was happening. Darius approached the alien being. His magnetic boots held him to the Vanguard's hull, each step a deliberate placement, and the alien hovered motionless a meter above the surface, and the gap between them was the width of an outstretched arm, close enough that his scanner was registering the being's electromagnetic output at full resolution, close enough that the bioluminescent glow cast faint, shifting light across the white surface of his EVA suit. The fear was there, deep, structural, the kind that came from understanding that the being in front of him was not a machine he could diagnose, or a system he could troubleshoot, or a material he could analyze with the instruments in his kit. It operated on principles his entire professional life had not prepared him for. Its body was the technology. Its skin was the communication system. Its mere existence in vacuum without life support represented a biological achievement that made Terran bioengineering look like a first-year student's sketch. But layered over the fear was something else, the thing that had kept Darius Koval in fleet engineering for 22 years, through 3 combat theaters, and a reactor breach, and 14 hours welding in vacuum, and 6 months of rehabilitation afterward. Curiosity. The specific, technical, problem-solving curiosity of an engineer confronted with something that did not fit into any existing category. Not the curiosity of a scientist, which wanted to classify and theorize. The engineer's curiosity, which wanted to know one thing: how does it work? The alien extended one of its upper limbs. Slowly. The bioluminescent patterns in its skin cycled to a configuration Darius had not seen before, dim, steady, concentrated at the limb's extremity, the rest of the body's output muted as though to reduce noise around a signal. An offering. A gesture calibrated to project the same thing Darius's spread hand had projected through the observation port. "I am not here to harm you." He extended his own hand. The glove of his EVA suit was thick, insulated, designed to protect against the thermal extremes of vacuum and the abrasive hazards of hull work. Through it, he could feel nothing of the alien's touch, no warmth, no texture, no pressure. But his diagnostic scanner could. The moment the alien's limb made contact with his gloved hand, the scanner on his forearm registered a cascade of data that filled the display with scrolling readouts. Electromagnetic pulses across 14 frequency bands, thermal variations in precise, repeating gradients, vibrational patterns transmitted through the physical contact point at frequencies ranging from subsonic to ultrasonic. Patterns encoded in multiple spectra simultaneously, layered and interlocking like the harmonics of a complex chord played on an instrument with 100 strings. The alien's body was producing organized information across every channel the scanner could detect, not broadcasting randomly, transmitting, structured, intentional. A species that had evolved to communicate through its entire physiology: light, heat, vibration, electromagnetic pulses, a species that transmitted meaning the way a star transmitted energy, across the entire spectrum, continuously in every direction, to anyone with instruments sensitive enough to listen. Darius could not read the message. The patterns were too complex, too alien, encoded in organizational principles his software had never been designed to parse. But he could record it, every pulse, every frequency, every variation, and he could respond. He activated his suit's external communication array, the system designed for suit-to-suit voice communication in vacuum, repurposed now for a conversation no one had anticipated. Not with voice. With the diagnostic scanner's calibration tone, a simple, repeating electromagnetic pulse at a fixed frequency, the universal first word of every diagnostic conversation in Terran engineering. The signal that said, "I am here. I am listening. This is my baseline. Let us establish a common reference." A handshake signal, the engineer's hello. The alien's bioluminescent patterns shifted. The cascading data on Darius's scanner reorganized the complex, multispectral output, simplified layer by layer, frequencies dropping away like instruments falling silent in an orchestra, until a single channel remained. A pulse at a frequency close to the calibration tone's range. Not identical. Close. Within the bandwidth that a Terran diagnostic scanner could resolve with precision. It was matching him, reducing its own vast communicative bandwidth to meet his limited range. The way an engineer working on a legacy system reduced the modern diagnostic interface to the older system's protocol speed, you didn't drag the old system up to your level. You went down to where the connection could happen. The being pulsed. Darius pulsed back. The being shifted frequency by a fraction. Darius matched. The being introduced a second pulse layered on the first, a more complex pattern, testing whether the scanner could resolve two simultaneous signals. Darius's scanner separated them cleanly, and he responded with a two-tone pattern of his own. A slow, iterative process. Two systems learning each other's operating parameters, establishing the overlap between what one could transmit and the other could receive, testing resolution, testing bandwidth, testing the boundaries of the channel they were building together, one exchange at a time. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of a human engineer and an alien being hovering above the hull of a Terran cruiser in the void between stars, trading electromagnetic pulses back and forth like two telegraph operators, tapping out test patterns across a line neither of them had used before. Neither of them certain the line would hold, both of them continuing anyway. Park's voice came through the helmet comm at minute 38. "Koval, are you seeing the data from the graft?" She had been monitoring the repair material from inside the ship. "The alien material in our hull, it's active. It's transmitting hull status back to the being. Temperature, stress loading, microfracture propagation. The graft is functioning as a diagnostic sensor embedded in our ship." The graft was not just a repair. It was a bridge. A piece of alien technology integrated into the Vanguard's hull that functioned as a continuous data link between the ship and the being that had placed it. A monitoring system installed at the point of damage, reporting the patient's condition to the doctor who had treated it. An engineer's solution to the problem of first contact. Don't start with words. Start with shared infrastructure. At minute 41, the alien transmitted a pattern that the diagnostic scanner's software flagged as structured data. Not random electromagnetic noise. Not a simple test pulse. A sequence with internal organization, repetition, variation, nested patterns, a grammar of electromagnetic pulses that followed rules Darius could detect even if he could not yet decode them. Language, or the skeleton of one, the scaffolding around which meaning could be built, one beam at a time. Darius recorded everything. He did not attempt to decode the sequence. That was work for the linguists and xenologists aboard the Accord, who would spend months or years analyzing what he was capturing in real time with a handheld diagnostic scanner never designed for the purpose. His job was the same job it had always been: make the connection, establish the link, build the bridge between two systems that were never designed to talk to each other, and make it strong enough to carry whatever weight the people who came after him needed it to bear. The being Darius had started thinking of it as the builder, because every behavior it exhibited oriented toward construction, repair, assessment of structural condition, the diagnostic attention of an intelligence whose primary relationship with the physical world was building and maintaining, extended a second limb and touched the Vanguard's hull. The bioluminescent patterns flowed across the repaired section, and the diagnostic scanner showed a burst of data exchange between the being's skin and the graft material embedded in the ship's armor. The builder was checking its work, running diagnostics on its own repair. The same thing Darius would have done after a hull patch: test the seal, check the bond, verify the load distribution. Then the builder touched the repaired hull and touched Darius's gloved hand, and the scanner registered the same structured pattern both times, the same organized data sequence, the same electromagnetic grammar. It was using the graft, the physical connection between alien material and Terran alloy, as a reference point, a shared object that existed in both their systems simultaneously, a common noun in a language that had no other words yet. This thing between us, this is where we start. Over the next 4 hours, Darius established what the linguists would later call the diagnostic protocol, a name he found gratifying because it was exactly what it was: a shared framework built on the one thing both species understood regardless of biology, regardless of evolutionary history, regardless of the incompatible architectures of their bodies and their technologies: the language of systems, how things were built, how they functioned, how they broke, how they were repaired. The alien communicated through its entire physiology: 14 electromagnetic frequency bands, thermal gradients, vibrational patterns, and Darius communicated through his diagnostic scanner's limited but precise output, and between them they assembled a vocabulary of patterns that described physical states: temperature, pressure, structural integrity, material composition, stress loading, thermal conductivity. The physics that governed both their technologies, however different those technologies were in implementation. Not words, not grammar, not meaning in the way that diplomats and linguists and philosophers meant meaning, but a functional bridge, a working channel through which two beings who shared nothing, not biology, not language, not environment, not history, not any of the common ground that communication usually required, could exchange information about the one domain they both inhabited: the physical world, the world of materials and forces and the things you built to survive in it. The builder showed Darius the graft material's molecular structure, transmitting a pattern that his scanner captured, and his engineering instincts parsed not as language but as a schematic, a self-organizing lattice that adapted to the substrate it bonded with, matching the crystal structure of Terran hull alloy at the bond interface, and transitioning to its native organic matrix over a gradient of a few millimeters. A material that healed the way living tissue healed, by becoming part of what it touched, by integrating rather than covering, by growing into the wound rather than sealing over it. Darius showed the builder, in return, the Vanguard's reactor schematic, not the classified details. He was an engineer, not a fool, and 22 years of service had taught him exactly where the line between cooperation and security sat. The basic architecture, how Terran reactors converted fuel to energy through controlled nuclear processes, how the energy was distributed through the power grid via electromagnetic conduit, how the thermal signature was managed through insulation layers and heat exchangers. He used the diagnostic scanner to pulse a simplified representation of the system, temperature gradients showing the reactor core, the transfer pathways, the thermal management architecture, and the builder responded with bioluminescent patterns that his slowly growing pattern recognition interpreted as focused interest. The electromagnetic equivalent of an engineer leaning in to study an unfamiliar schematic. Two engineers comparing notes, one organic, one mechanical, one who grew its technology from living systems the way a coral grew a reef, one who assembled technology from refined materials the way a stonemason built a wall. Both solving the same fundamental problem: how to survive in a universe that was not designed for survival, using whatever tools evolution and ingenuity had provided. At hour 5, the builder transmitted a sustained pattern that Darius did not recognize from the slowly growing shared vocabulary. Complex, multi-layered, cycling through frequency ranges that the diagnostic scanner captured but could not categorize within the emerging framework. The pattern repeated 3 times, each repetition slightly modified, as though the builder was refining a transmission to ensure clarity. After the 3rd repetition, the builder oriented all 4 of its limbs toward the station and held the posture for 10 seconds. An invitation, as clear as any gesture Darius had ever received from a fellow engineer, pointing toward a machine and saying, "Come look at this." Darius reported to the captain. Vazik listened with the expression of a woman doing math in her head: risk assessment, opportunity cost, the probability matrices that command officers ran continuously and never discussed. The Ironholt's captain argued against it over the command channel: protocol violation, security risk, unknown biological hazard, no atmospheric analysis, no backup extraction plan. The full litany of reasons not to accept an alien species invitation to visit a 60-kilometer station, about which they knew almost nothing except that it could shoot with impossible precision and repair damage with technology that bonded at the molecular level. Vazik overruled him. The Ironholt has the guns. The Accord has the diplomats. I have the engineer who just spent 5 hours building a common language, with that being using a diagnostic scanner and hull alloy. If anyone goes, it's him, and if it goes wrong, the destroyer is still here. Darius went. The builder's sphere carried him across the 400 kilometers to the station. He sat in the bioluminescent interior, warm light shifting around him in patterns that the scanner registered as continuous data. The sphere itself, apparently a living extension of the station's communication network, breathing his suit's recycled air, watching through the sphere's translucent wall as the station grew from a distant glow to a presence that filled his entire visual field. The hull surface passed a meter from the sphere's skin, close enough to see the texture in detail, the fractal branching patterns, the pulsing bioluminescent nodes, the seamless organic continuity of a structure that had never known a weld seam or a rivet, or the controlled violence of industrial fabrication. The sphere entered the station through an aperture that dilated open at their approach and sealed behind them with the smooth, silent motion of a living membrane. And Darius Koval, chief engineering officer of the Cassini Vanguard, 22 years of service, 3 combat theaters, 1 reactor breach that had left him with titanium pins in his left shoulder, and a radiation exposure badge that his medical officer checked every 6 months, found himself inside a space that his professional vocabulary could not describe. The interior was vast. The scale was immediately disorienting, the ceiling 100 meters overhead, the walls curving away in organic arcs that followed biological rather than architectural logic, the volume of the chamber large enough to contain the Vanguard 3 times over with room remaining. Bioluminescent light filled the space in gradients of warm amber and cool blue, shifting slowly in patterns that the diagnostic scanner registered as structured data. The station itself was communicating, broadcasting its internal state through its walls, its surfaces, its structure, the way the builder broadcast through its skin. And there were others. Dozens of builders, distributed through the space at various heights and positions, some clinging to the curved walls with their four limbs splayed for stability, some moving through the open volume with the effortless grace of organisms in their native element, some clustered around structures that Darius's engineering instincts identified as workstations or fabrication nodes or diagnostic terminals. They registered his presence, bioluminescent patterns shifting toward him, sensory clusters orienting, and then returned to their tasks. Not alarmed, not hostile, not performing for his benefit, not stopping their work to stare at the visitor. Working. A civilization going about its business while a stranger stood in its living room. The most disarming reception Darius could imagine, not because it was calculated to disarm, but because it treated his arrival as unremarkable, as though visitors were expected, as though the universe was supposed to contain other species, and the arrival of one was not a crisis but a Tuesday. The builder who had repaired his ship guided him through the station for 3 hours. It showed him the fabrication chambers, vast organic vats that produced the self-organizing lattice material through sustained biological process, the material growing the way a tree produced wood or a mollusk produced shell, layer by layer, structured by biological template rather than industrial tooling. It showed him the energy systems, not reactors, not fusion plants, not any technology that burned or split or contained, but distributed biological networks that converted ambient radiation into usable power across the entire station surface, the way photosynthetic organisms converted sunlight, except these organisms operated across the full electromagnetic spectrum and achieved conversion efficiencies that made Terran solar technology look like cupping your hands to catch rain. It showed him the communication architecture, bioluminescent pathways running through the station's structure like a nervous system, carrying information at light speed between every node and every builder in the habitat, every wall and surface a display, every structural member a data conduit. He watched a pair of builders repairing a section of interior wall, the damaged area glowing with diagnostic patterns that both beings read simultaneously, their limbs moving in coordinated sequence without any visible exchange of instruction. They knew what the other was doing because the wall told them both. The station was not a structure that contained a population. It was a shared nervous system that happened to have a population living inside it. In one chamber, he found what his engineering instincts identified as a training space. Younger builders, smaller, their bioluminescent patterns less refined, working on small structures under the observation of a larger individual whose patterns cycled with the patient, repetitive cadence of a teacher demonstrating technique. They were learning to grow material, shaping lattice samples with their limbs, testing bond strength, discarding failures, trying again. The process was familiar in a way that crossed every biological boundary between Darius's species and theirs. Apprenticeship, the handing down of knowledge through practice and correction, and the accumulated patience of someone who had already made every mistake the student was about to make. He stood and watched for several minutes, and the teacher builder oriented its sensory clusters toward him and produced a pattern that his scanner recorded and his instincts translated without conscious effort. Acknowledgement, not of a visitor, of a fellow practitioner. The recognition that the being watching understood what was being taught, because it had learned the same lessons in a different medium. And in each chamber, at each system, the builder who guided him paused and transmitted its diagnostic patterns, and Darius transmitted his, and the shared vocabulary grew. Not fast, not fluently, not with the precision that language required or the richness that meaning demanded, but steadily, the way a bridge grew one structural member at a time, each one load tested before the next was placed, each one carrying a little more weight than the last. At the end of the third hour, the builder brought him to a chamber near the station's center, smaller than the others. The bioluminescent light here was dimmer, the pattern slower, the atmosphere contemplative in a way that transcended biology. Something about the space communicated importance and care regardless of species. In the center of the chamber, mounted on a structure that pulsed with the station's bioluminescent glow, was an object. A hull plate, Terran manufacture, standard fleet-grade alloy, the molecular composition unmistakable on Darius's scanner. Cut clean, the edges showing the precise energy weapon severance pattern that matched the beam that had grazed the Vanguard. A piece of a Terran ship, removed with surgical precision, mounted and displayed and studied. Not the Vanguard. The alloy composition matched Terran fleet standard, but the plates aged the oxidation patterns, the microfracture signatures, the radiation weathering suggested it had been here for years. Perhaps a decade, perhaps longer. A piece of a ship that had passed through this region of space before the contact group arrived, before Fleet Command detected the builder's emissions, before anyone knew this species existed. The builders had found a piece of humanity before humanity found the builders, and instead of discarding it or weaponizing it or filing it in a database, they had preserved it, studied it, mounted it in a chamber near the heart of their station, the way a museum mounted an artifact of significance. Darius looked at the builder. The being's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to the slowest, most deliberate configuration he had seen in 9 hours of contact, each pulse distinct, each transition measured, the biological equivalent of speaking carefully because the words mattered and the listener mattered and the moment mattered. The builder touched the hull plate, then touched the graft material on the repair tool it still carried, then touched Darius's gloved hand. 3 touches, 3 materials, Terran alloy, alien lattice, human hand. The pattern it transmitted was the most complex sequence Darius had recorded. His scanner captured every frequency, every layer, every harmonic, and his engineering mined the part of him that had spent 22 years translating the language of systems into the language of action, parsed it not as language but as a schematic, a diagnostic readout. The builder was showing him the relationship between the 3 materials. How the Terran alloy was structured rigid, crystalline, strong in compression, brittle under certain shear loads, a material that resisted change until it broke. How the alien lattice was structured adaptive, organic, self-organizing, a material that responded to stress by reorganizing rather than fracturing. And how, at the molecular bond site where the graft met the hull, the two became something that was neither Terran nor alien but both. A new material, a composite, a joint where 2 incompatible systems found the interface where coexistence was possible. The hull plate in the chamber was not a trophy, not a warning, not a specimen pinned to a board. It was a study, a piece of homework, an analysis conducted with the patient attention of a species that understood materials the way Darius understood conduit relays intimately, from the inside, through the accumulated knowledge of a career spent working at the boundary between function and failure. The builders had found a piece of Terran technology, and they had spent years understanding it, learning its composition, mapping its properties, developing the graft material specifically to bond with it, not as a weapon, not as a tool of infiltration, but as an answer to a question. Can we connect? And when the contact group arrived, they had used that knowledge not to attack, not to dominate, not to demonstrate superiority. They had used it to introduce themselves the only way they knew how. A range-finding shot that said, "We know what you are made of." A repair that said, "And we can work with it." An invitation that said, "Come see what we are made of." And a hull plate in a quiet chamber that said, "We have been waiting to show someone." Darius thought about the years. The years the builders had spent with that plate analyzing it, developing the graft material to bond with it, preparing for the moment when the species that had made it arrived. The patience of that preparation staggered him, not the technological achievement, impressive as it was. The patience, the willingness to invest years of work toward a meeting that might never happen, with a species that might never come, on the chance, the hope that the void between the stars was not permanent. That isolation was a condition, not a sentence. They had been waiting, not passively, not the inert waiting of a species that had exhausted its options and had nothing left to do but sit, actively, productively, building the tools of connection before the connection was possible, the way an engineer fabricated components for a system that had not been designed yet, trusting that the design would come, that the need would materialize, that the work done in advance would find its purpose. Darius stood in the center of a 60-kilometer living station, surrounded by a species that breathed vacuum and grew its technology from biological substrate, and communicated through the full electromagnetic spectrum with a bandwidth that made human language look like tapping on a pipe. And he felt the fear settle into its proper place, not gone, not conquered, but integrated. Present alongside the curiosity and the professional respect, and the slowly dawning recognition that the being in front of him was not an enigma or a threat or a specimen. It was a colleague, working in a different medium with different tools toward the same end. Building things that held. He transmitted the calibration tone one more time. The builder responded. And in the slow, patient, iterative language they had constructed together over 9 hours, a language of temperature and pressure and structural integrity, and the way materials behaved when you put them next to each other, and asked them to bear weight. Darius said the only thing an engineer could say when standing inside someone else's workshop for the first time. Surrounded by tools he did not recognize and solutions he had never imagined, and a lifetime's evidence of a different answer to the same questions his own species had been asking since it first shaped stone into an edge. Show me how it works. When he returned to the Vanguard 18 hours after he had left it, the diplomatic corvette Accord had established a formal communication link with the station using a protocol framework adapted from Darius's diagnostic recordings. The Ironholt had stood down from combat readiness. The Accord science team had a preliminary xenolinguistic model running, built on the structured data patterns Darius's scanner had captured during those first 40 minutes of electromagnetic handshaking above the Vanguard's hull. Captain Vazik was waiting at the airlock with an expression that mixed relief and something Darius rarely saw on her face. Pride. Not the institutional pride of a mission milestone achieved, the personal kind. The kind that came from having trusted the right person with an impossible job and watching them do it with a diagnostic scanner and a calibration tone. The Accords team is requesting your diagnostic logs, she said. All of them. 14 hours of continuous recording. The linguists are calling what you built a functional pigeon. First one ever established between a human and an alien species through engineering telemetry rather than language. It's not a pigeon. It's a handshake protocol. We established a common reference frame for physical properties. The actual language works semantics, grammar, meaning that's going to take years. Maybe decades. The Ironholt's captain filed a formal protest about my decision to send you out. What did you tell him? I told him that the first functional communication between humanity and an alien civilization was established by a chief engineer with a diagnostic scanner, and that the diplomatic corps can put that in their report however they like. Darius stripped out of his EVA suit in the airlock staging area, feeling the weight of 18 hours and a species-level encounter settle into his muscles like lead. He walked to the engineering bay and sat at his station and listened to the ship around him. The Vanguard systems hummed with the familiar language of a vessel in good working order, Reactor at steady state. Life support cycling within nominal parameters. The hull intact and sealed, every structural member bearing its designed load. And on the port side, at frame 44, the alien graft integrated so cleanly into the armor plating that the structural integrity readings showed the repaired section was now stronger than the original hull. The graft pulsed faintly with residual bioluminescence, a thin line of warmth in the cold geometry of Terran alloy, visible on the diagnostic panel as a gentle undulation of thermal data that would continue for as long as the material lived. A thread of alien technology woven into a human ship, a joint, a bond, the first physical connection between two civilizations that had never known each other existed, holding steady under the stress of vacuum and silence and 400 kilometers of void. The fear was still there. It would be there for a long time, the deep, structural recognition that the universe contained intelligences that operated on principles humanity did not yet understand, that the gap between Terran engineering and whatever the builders had achieved was not a matter of years or decades but of kind, and that the work of understanding would outlast Darius's career and probably his life. But the connection was there too. 9 hours of diagnostic pulses and calibration tones, and the slow, patient process of two beings standing at the interface between their respective systems, and finding the narrow band where communication could occur. Not the grand, theatrical first contact of diplomatic speeches and treaty signings and interstellar broadcasts. The engineer's version, quiet, technical, built one pulse at a time on the shared understanding that every system, biological or mechanical, grown or assembled, alien or human, communicated its condition to anyone willing to learn the language it was already speaking. The builder had come to the breach, had touched the damage, had fixed it with material designed through years of study to bond with what it found, had waited, had matched its vast communicative bandwidth to the narrow channel of a diagnostic scanner because that was the channel the human could receive on, had shown him its home, had shared its work, had taken him to a quiet chamber and shown him a piece of Terran hull mounted with the care of a species that understood what it meant to find something new in the void, and to treat that discovery as precious. And Darius had done the only thing he knew how to do. He had shown up where the damage was, and he had listened with the tools he had, and he had answered in the only language available, the language of materials under stress, of systems reporting their condition, of the narrow band where two incompatible architectures found enough common ground to exchange a single meaningful pulse. It was not peace, it was not alliance, it was not understanding. Those were structures that would take years to build, engineered by diplomats and linguists and politicians working at scales and speeds that Darius would watch from a distance, the way he watched capital ships maneuver, aware of the forces involved, respectful of the complexity, content to do his own work at the joint where things actually touched. It was a repair, the first one, the one that proved the materials could bond. And in 22 years of fixing things that the universe broke, Darius Koval had learned that the repair was where the real work happened. Not in the design phase, where everything was theoretical and clean, and the materials existed only on a schematic. Not in the planning meetings, where the parameters were discussed and the tolerances were specified, and the failure modes were cataloged. At the break point, where two edges that were never meant to touch were forced together by circumstance, and someone had to stand there with a diagnostic scanner and a calibration tone, and the patience to work in increments, and figure out how to make them hold. The graft held, the connection held, and somewhere between a Terran cruiser and a 60-kilometer living station, the calibration tone still pulsed, steady, patient, repeating the engineer's first word, still echoing across the void, still waiting for the conversation that would take the rest of both their lives to finish.